Hello and Merry Christmas to you in this month of December. My name is Dr. Kurt Jiris and I'm the Executive Director of Faith Ascent, and I'm pleased to introduce to you this two-part video series on an intriguing apologetic topic. It's something that maybe you hadn't considered before, and it's really exciting to think about. When we read the New Testament, when we read the story of the birth of Jesus, there are details there in the story, and those details correspond to reality. And what are the ways that we can know that they correspond to reality and that they just weren't made up by an author? Well, archaeology is one of those ways we can think that the text is trustworthy. And so I've invited my friend Ted Wright of Epic Archaeology to share with us some material so that we can be a bit more confident about what we read in the New Testament about the story of the birth of Jesus. So I'm excited for the content that he has to share with us, and here he is, Ted Wright of Epic Archaeology.
The Christmas story is one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible, and Christians around the world, when they hear the Christmas story, one of the things that they really remember about it is the Star of Bethlehem. And the question we want to explore today is exactly what did the wise men see in the night sky 2,000 years ago, and is there any way that we can discover what that might have been using history and archaeology and even astronomy? So as we look at the text of the Bible, historians and archaeologists for at least over 100 years have found hundreds if not thousands of archaeological discoveries that show that the Bible is historically accurate. And we can use the same tools that archaeologists in the past have used, with even one additional tool to discover perhaps what the wise men may have seen on that night when they came to the manger of Christ. So we want to explore that right now. So in order to do that, we need to lay out some basic ideas of where to actually find this data in history. So we go to the text itself, and in the Bible, the New Testament tells us that Jesus was born during the days of Augustus. And we know from history and through other historical sources besides the Bible that Augustus was a Caesar by the name of Octavius, who was the nephew of Julius Caesar. And then the second thing it tells us is that Jesus was also born during the reign of Herod the Great, that we also know through history, through Josephus, as well as other writers of the time. So the question then is exactly when was Christ born? And when we can discern that, then we can try to figure out what the wise men may have seen. So one of the proposed birth dates for the birth of Christ has been 3 or 2 BC. And we're going to get to that here in just a second. But let me just say a couple of things here about what you may or may not have heard. And that is that one of the key things in determining the wise men and their time and their relationship to the Star of Bethlehem is the death of Herod the Great, which some scholars have said was in 4 BC. In fact, this was actually put forth by a scholar back in the 19th century by the name of Emil Schurer, who wrote a book called The Life of Jesus in the Early Church, written in about 1897, 1898. He put forth the date of 4 BC. But all of the early church fathers, 9 of them to be specific, have stated that Jesus was born during the 41st year of the reign of Augustus, which would then place the birth of Christ in 3 or 2 BC. So if that's the case, then Herod could not have died in 4 BC. He must have died in some other time. So we're going to get to that here in just a minute, though. But before we get into some of the details of the Bethlehem star, I do want to talk about this idea of using astronomy to determine dates in history. So this whole discipline is called, it's a really interesting subject called Archaeo-Astronomy. It's using the word archaeology and astronomy, so it's literally ancient astronomy. Now, it's very different than astrology, Astrology is the study of the stars, and the ancient people would think that, the stars would actually cause good luck or bad luck. It goes all the way back to the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and even the ancient Sumerians believed that the stars had some kind of causal connection between the events of their lives and the movement of the stars in the heavens. And it's actually condemned on the pages of the Old Testament. So the Jewish people were forbidden to actually use the stars to try to determine their fortune or determine what the future might be. So that is condemned very clearly in the Bible. That's not what we're talking about with archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy is the use of stars to determine dates, because when you think about it, the night sky is a giant clock. It's a giant clock that tells us the times and the dates and the seasons. There was a very important discovery that took place back in the 1600s by a German astronomer by the name of Johannes Kepler. And Kepler published his book called The Laws of Planetary Motion. Now, the importance of this and how this figures into determining the stars, the star Bethlehem, or what the wise men may have seen, is that it made corrections in the orbits of the planets. Because before Kepler, most astronomers believed that the planets actually moved in perfect circles. But what Kepler discovered is that the planets actually move in elliptical orbits. So what this means in English is basically that now with Kepler's laws of planetary motion, astronomers are now able to calculate really precise dates for the movement of the stars in history. So, this is actually an important thing for archaeologists and historians, because when you have in a historical writing mention of a particular astronomical event, so say a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, then now we can actually use software programs to go back in time, sort of like a time machine, and see what the night sky would have looked like at a particular time in history. And so let me give you two examples of this so you can see kind of how it works. One example is from ancient Egypt, an example of archaeoastronomy, and it has to do with something called the Ebers Papyrus, which was an ancient Egyptian manuscript that dates to something called the heliacal rising of the Sothic dog star to year 9, month 3, season 3, day 9, around the 15th of May of a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep I's reign, sometime around 1550 to 1529 BC. This astronomical event fixes the composition to an identifiable time in the 18th dynasty of Egypt. So since astronomers can pinpoint this event by charting the positions of the stars in the ancient world, the papyrus can be firmly dated to 1541 BC, making this pharaoh's initial regnal year as 1550 BC. This is an example of archaeoastronomy. Another example of archaeoastronomy is in a story that you are familiar with, and it's the story of Jonah and the preaching of Nineveh. Of course, most folks know that Jonah was swallowed by a great fish, perhaps a whale, we don't really know, but he was swallowed by a great fish, and that's what most people believe. And understand, and I believe that as well, and that's what they remember. But what's interesting about this is that when we look back in time, there was actually a full solar eclipse on June the 15th, 763 BC over Nineveh. Now, what's interesting about this is that we know through historical sources in the Neo-Assyrian Empire that when eclipses happened, this was a bad omen in ancient Assyria. And so this would mean that Jonah, when he came into Nineveh to preach repentance to the people of Nineveh, they would have been ready to hear his message. So God's timing was absolutely perfect. So by using this solar eclipse on June the 15th, 763 BC, we are now able to pinpoint the exact day of when Jonah actually preached to the Ninevites in ancient Nineveh, perhaps a few days after the eclipse happened. And so again, this is another example of how historians and archaeologists can actually use astronomy to pinpoint dates in history. So next, we want to actually look at the dating of the death of Herod the Great and exactly when we can pinpoint that, because then that will help us to pinpoint when Christ was born, and then also perhaps what the wise men may have seen on that night when they came to visit the Christ child.
Thanks for watching this first part of the Star of Bethlehem two-part series. I hope you'll see, as I know, that Ted is an enthusiastic presenter, and the content that he's talking about is so fascinating to see how it aligns with the biblical story. So I look forward to having you join us next week as Ted goes through the second part of the Star of Bethlehem.